It's the Watchdog versus the man. All right. Thank you guys very much for tuning in here to this episode of The Watchdog, and shalom, shalom. I am, of course, your host, CJ Cox. I am joined today by Adam Kokesh from Adam versus the Man. We are going to actually discuss a couple interesting topics today. I've termed the recording today the state of liberty, as in the state of liberty in the United States as it stands right now. A lot of people are very, shall we say, heightened in their awareness of some of our liberties going away. But I think, and I'm fairly certain Mr. Kokesh would agree with me, we could not have gotten to the 2020 point without a lot of history that is not being noticed by people. History on both sides of the political aisle, and even sometimes outside of those sides of the political aisle. So I kind of wanted to just, go through some of that and start to build, a little bit more of a network here for people who do actually have fight for liberty. You know what I mean? Because it's going to get, hopefully people are going to get more and more aware as time goes on. Jorgensen and Johnson, the last couple of election cycles, seem to have done well, but the polls kind of sort of, I don't know. Well, who knows, right? But we'll get into all that. But
the biggest question there has got to be how much has been stolen. How many votes have been stolen from the Libertarian Party?
Yeah, no kidding.
In the last two election cycles, but historically, and obviously most importantly, looking at Jorgensen, I think she was cheated more than Gary Johnson by raw votes taken away because you represented a real threat. And I mean, if we're going to talk about all this, I might need a bong rip here. My new studio bong in the new studio here. I think we're calling it Ma Bong. But yeah, man, it's the current state. Before I do this, I want to say I appreciate you asking the bigger picture questions and bringing people together, in the spirit of freedom. But I don't have any. Well, I don't want to say any, but I have not lost faith in my long-term view of freedom and humanity marching forward and progressing and getting more free, more peaceful, more harmonious, more loving, more aware, healthier over time. And given that, I have questioned that a little bit lately, and I have been looking at the bigger picture and the longer term picture with Corona. And by the way, I'm going to give myself a big plug here because I think this is an important part. And I know this is part of what you do, but part of what I do with Adam versus the Man, doing a daily news show Monday through Friday, 9 to 11 a.m. Pacific live, 2 hours a day, 5 days a week. I'm looking at the news. I got my head in the news every day. And one of the things that I noticed that we tend to do differently as libertarians or independent media is that we don't get caught up in the 24-hour news cycle of be afraid of this now and forget what we told you to be afraid about yesterday, or else you're going to die from whatever we're telling you to be afraid of now. No, that thing we said yesterday, totally irrelevant. We're not even going to mention it, but be afraid about this now with politicians and the authorities are telling you you're supposed to be afraid of it. Let us pass on the spear, and just being able to step back and give a sort of non-rushed view of the world. And it's not that we don't, hey, these are the headlines you need to know today. We cover that. We give you that. We think that's really important. But especially right now, and I think in my 14 years as an activist, most of which has included an element of independent journalism, I think right now more than ever we're seeing the importance of this because Corona has been with us one way or another for, in the United States, like since February. It depends on where you want to start. You want to start with Trump's declaration of a national state of emergency in March. Yeah, the blood's on his hands too here. But this period of time, you remember it was, well, it's not a threat, but we have to flatten the curve. Right. When was the last time you heard flatten the curve in the news? You remember the original projections when they said, oh, it's the UK and the US we're going to look at. 2 million are going to die in the United States. And now somehow they've got people freaking out over a projection of 400,000, a current number of something a little over 200,000, where we know that, some of those, a huge chunk of those deaths, well, we know that from the FDA or from, what was the number that was released. It was 6%. Only 6% of those deaths are COVID exclusive.
Yeah, the CDC released the 9,200 was the actual number.
Yes.
But yeah, 6% of the total deaths.
Yeah, it was like right after we hit the 200,000 mark, CDC came out. It was big news for everybody who wants to go, oh, it's only 6%. But in a way, that's kind of false science bait in and of itself, because if it's only 6%, then you have to ask, well, for how many was it a significant contributor? You gotta give COVID credit for that. But then you gotta subtract. First of all, you gotta subtract all the ones that were people who died with COVID, not from COVID, for whom it was not even a significant factor. And then you gotta subtract all the fraud. And we know that that's significant. And one of the things that pisses me off, and I don't being offended is fucking bullshit and all that. I don't get angry. I don't let them steal my emotional freedom too. But it does piss me off at a certain level that Trump ordered the CDC to conduct deliberations in private, and in secret, and that they're holding data. So we don't know. Like, we really don't know, of those 200,000 reported deaths in the United States, how many does COVID actually deserve credit for? And that would, I think, help finally put this threat in perspective. But I'm not a denier. There's a real threat. It's it's not something to be ignored. No health threat is ever an excuse to violate any individual's rights. I can tell you that much. And that alone points the way to a lot of how to handle this. But even just to put a scope on how big is the threat itself, I still don't know. I don't think you can. I mean, maybe, and with all appropriate respect for those who have done the research and picked it apart and think that they have a more accurate take on this than I do, but we just don't know, because we're being lied to so much. The numbers are being manipulated so much. And I think it's fair to say that this is somewhere around as deadly as a seasonal flu, a funky off-season flu, perhaps. It could be 2 or 3 times more deadly. But man, it pisses me off that I don't know. And right now, to get to your bigger question, why I feel the need to take a bong rip to get into this subject, as much as I still see, the fun, as John McCain would say, or George W. All these pricks. The fundamentals of the American economy are strong. That's my generic American politician impression. This is Bill Clinton, though. The thumb point. I feel your pain.
Yeah.
I can't point because this is rude, and then you get a funny picture of me. But if I go, I feel your pain.
See, that's a specifically like kind of Bible Belt thing too. You know what I mean? Like a lot of Southern politicians, left and right, do that whole thing.
Yeah, no, they teach that. It's part of like political communication. Don't point, thumb point. It's like a nice hand, But we are in a. So anyway, the fundamentals of America are strong. The fundamentals of humanity are strong. We are still engaged in this beautiful dance forward, and it's 2 steps backwards, 1 step, or 2 steps forward, 1 step backward. Yeah, it's still net positive. But yeah, right now, centered around coronaphobia, this dark cloud hanging over humanity, I can't deny that we're in the middle of a big step backwards. That is really a relatively short or midterm phenomenon of the last year of coronaphobia, of a truly scary ramping up of government power. The way I take sort of comfort in that bigger picture perspective is, hey, at least they're not making war anymore, right? This is the best racket, and it's all to protect the banking racket. What is the purpose of government? Keep the super rich getting richer at the expense of the rest of us. Don't complain about government not working. It's functioning especially well right now.
So there's some immediate things that I would want to get sort of your comment on with that too. And I love that a lot of the points that you make there about, not being a denier, but still not necessarily thinking that this is something that's justified, because it isn't, right? And people tend to think that those are, exclusive, right? You either deny the COVID virus outright, or you are okay with having this whole litany of lockdowns and all this kind of stuff. Right. One of the bigger things,
if I may, first, there's something even more fundamental I want to point out, and I hope your audience appreciates the personal value from this little insight is that none of this is a reason to lose your fucking cool. None of this is a reason to lose your center, to give up your emotional freedom, to allow yourself to be manipulated. And so I would challenge everybody to ask, when you're being told something, what mood, what emotion are they trying to evoke in me? Are they trying to make me afraid? Because if they're trying to make me afraid, fuck them. That's dual manipulation. And with Adam versus the Man, you could say, well, we're trying to make you afraid of government, but we explicitly come out and say, no, don't be afraid. Be happy. Be centered. Be zen. Be in control of your emotions. Don't let other people use them to manipulate you. And if you don't include that as part of your message, and you're just, here's bad things. Be afraid. Be afraid. Be afraid. Fuck you. By emotional standards, you're not a credible news source. And you think about your political news, it's almost all fear-based. And I think one of the greatest things about my message and the message of freedom in general is that it's one of hope and emotional freedom.
Well, and so with that, I want to jump into some of the specifics here about the COVID threat, right? I think the big one that is on a lot of people's minds right now, simply because of the Harris-Biden ticket that is, of course, falsely called the Biden-Harris ticket.
Yep.
So there seems to be a certain level of support amongst, and I wouldn't say it is exclusively the left, but definitely the Democratic Party has seemed to have bought onto it whole hog. It seems to have split Republican Party about pretty well 50-50 almost between some like Trumpists and more like Romney, neocon, traditional kind of guys, right? But this idea of national, national mandates, national vaccinations, national mask mandates, national contact tracing, right? Things which, of course, not only could you not find in our Constitution, but you certainly couldn't find in the writings of like men like Thomas Jefferson, who were trying to set up the Declaration of Independence, our what would you call those, founders? Sorry, and Thomas Paine and numerous of the other people who we tend to take influence from, or at least we did at some point. That obviously a lot of people have challenged. They don't think that it's going to be able to happen because of certain legal things like the judges and localization stuff like that. Your message in the presidential run of 2020 was a pretty what most people might consider a radical localization that at this point now is not sounding so radical, maybe, right?
Hold on that point. I'm glad you used that word because it does deserve a disclaimer or an explanation. I embrace the word radical because it's come to be confused with extremism deliberately, right, by misrepresentation. But the word itself means to strike at the root of the problem. Like Henry David Thoreau said, for every 1,000 striking at the branches of evil, there is one striking the root. And as opposed to playing this silly game of arguing over different flavors of statism, striking at not even real, but artificially perceived social wedge issues, kind of branches of evil. But the root is this concept of centralized force of government that can force its will on everyone. So to your main part of the question about Corona, one of the things we saw, actually, just before I plugged in with you, I was looking at Drudge Report. One of the headlines was that a top Biden aide sees a continuation of local mandates rather than a national mandate. But then we also covered the story earlier today that Ticketmaster may end up requiring proof of vaccination in order to sell you tickets. Now, you might go, well, Adam, that's Ticketmaster. It's a private company. They want to set their own standard. That's fine. But that's not how the fuck Ticketmaster became fucking Ticketmaster, with its very inconvenient convenience fees and all the other ripoffs that go along with corporatism and consolidation of economic power under a ripoff called fascism, which is the merging of corporations in the state. It's the opposite of capitalism, where a company or an individual actor is able to succeed or fail on their own merits. Under corporatism, you have shitty companies that should be run out of business, propped up by government subsidies and favorable regulations. And so when Ticketmaster comes out and says, well, now you can't go to concerts, I said, oh no, you're still allowed to host independent concerts, but all the big stuff, oh yeah, that's us. Yeah, we got all that, right? And it's like you can't go to concerts if you don't have the COVID vaccine. Is that really Ticketmaster saying that, or is that government using Ticketmaster to say that? You know, and this is where, as libertarians, we have to recognize that there's a challenge to discern while we are the only ones actually defining government at all. In reality, what is the actual edge of government? Are you a government? Are you government if government hires you for a temp job? Are you a government employee? Do we call you government? But this phenomenon, obviously, the central institution of coercion is present in a lot of corporations, and those corporations in America today become mechanisms of enforcement, which makes them coercive. And because that authority is backed up with government, I think at that point, we can fairly say they have crossed that ethical line where they are now part of the corporate institution, or the coercive institution of government, and the corporate institution branding, letterhead, what have you, is kind of an artificial separation of something that is really more semi-autonomous at best rather than autonomous. So to the vaccines, are they going to be or a national mask mandate? It's kind of like, are they going to get away with it? How much can they subvert our freedoms in order to serve their sponsors? And there are a lot of checks on this, but when they propose some of these horrific things, like a national lockdown or national mandated vaccinations to whatever extent they can, I don't think they're going to get away with that. There's too many people like me who live down 3 miles of private dirt road, on 10 acres off grid, where I can say, screw you guys, I don't need you. And I'm surrounded. I'm not armed because I'm a felon, but I'm surrounded by very well-known neighbors out here. And so a lot of times you hear these threats. I think people kind of play into it in an unrealistic way or an unhelpful way. There's a sort of political back and forth baiting that happens where, for example, Biden proposes national mask mandates, and maybe by his assessment, polling, surveys, research, what have you, he knows that's not even a viable policy. Like that, if the federal government, I'm not saying this is necessarily true, but if I had $1 million and I wanted to find out, I could, with reasonable certainty, tell you if the federal government could even get away, or what it would take for the federal government to get away with a national mask mandate, and how much that would cost them. If Biden does that, would that cost Texas to secede or not? That would have to be factored into this equation. But the bigger picture, to give you a sort of personal experience kind of example of this, and I'm not saying my personal experience, hypothetical. Someone comes up to you on the street and says, I'm going to steal your wallet, I'm going to murder you, and I'm going to rape your wife. And you go, oh shit. And you put up your dukes, go, oh my God, I got to fight this. And he says, okay, give me your wallet, I'll leave you alone. And you go, okay. And you go, whoo, well, I got away with only giving him my wallet. And you're like happy that you gave a stranger your wallet because he threatened you. Wait, you see what they're doing there? There's a sort of overreach in the threat of, we could have national mask mandates, and then you'll be happy if all we have is this bullshit fluctuating local policy.
Right. Well, and one thing I want to jump back to COVID, but I do want to briefly ask, just because you did already kind of hint to it. There is a certain tyranny of corporations almost, right? Where it's not like they're necessarily a violation from a government perspective, but like, for example, YouTube is, it's where the vast majority of people are at this point are getting news, where they're getting their philosophy, where they're getting their history, religious sermons, their entertainment. Everything, right? The both of us are on YouTube, right? It's this huge corporate. Say again?
Homesteading how-to videos.
Right, exactly. Like it is this massive corporation that has just changed everything. And you see that with Twitter and with Facebook and with Google and with Amazon. And they are able to curb content in such a way that is, kind of a censorship in and of itself. And even in a lot of senses, real, like Twitter at this point even censors the president of the United States, right? Now,
about that, just to respond to that first, you want to get on my experience being banned and getting strikes and stuff for questioning the WHO and COVID policy at even the local level. I'm happy to, but I got to set the stage for this with the bigger picture, since you started with the conservative and the censorship of Trump. And I don't want to say that that's not real, but it's a distraction. If you're the powers that be and you don't care if America goes with red flavored fascism or blue flavored fascism. Either way, you're going to be okay. You really don't care about this partisan fight. Then, when if you really wanted to bury the message that is a threat, the libertarian message, then you're gonna create a diversion that makes it look like there's a conspiracy that someone can solve if you get one layer deep, but you got to get a second layer. And the first layer is this the bullshit mainstream story of modern social media censorship, which is liberal controlled social media outlets are socially are censoring conservative, and the conservatives get to make a big Streisand effect out of this, and they don't mind because that's all hiding the fact that the real victims of censorship are libertarians. And I can tell you easily from any kind of data you'd put together on this that the proportion of libertarian media outlets who have experienced shadow banning or censorship at a significant level is way higher than among conservatives. So if your conversation is sort of like, let's say, 45% liberal, 45% conservative, and 10% libertarian, absolutely challenging authority in the middle, and you don't want to censor that 10% without hiding it, because if you only censor that 10%, the base of the rest is going to go, hey, what's being censored? But if you can distract them and say, look, censorship is a red, blue, left, right fight, we're going to censor all this 10% of libertarians, but now we're going to censor 20% from the conservatives, so you don't even notice that libertarians are being censored. And you keep us out of the conversation even more effectively than if you just censored us directly.
Well, and I would point out too, there's even a certain level of bullying against even completely apolitical and often, liberal in their personal lives creators, right? Like, for example, Shane Dawson and Tana Mojo, right? People completely apolitical in their personal lives. They're very liberal, both in culturally and politically speaking. But the censorship pulled off in this case by YouTube through shadow banning and demonetization, and even just cultural pressures, right? It starts to put, and my point in that is just to say that when people ignore the censorship of a Jimmy Dore or an Alex Jones or a Jason Burmis or an Adam Kokesh or et cetera, right? It does bleed in to affect them, and then they get bullied into even like seemingly supporting it because it's a left-right issue. Now, if you're on the left, well, no, they're these good guys, even though they just censored you too. You know what I mean? And if you're on the right, of course, it's
one of the things that, if I may, just to back that up, one of the things that's scary about this and the current wave of censorship is how much COVID is an appropriate excuse if you believe the mainstream narrative, right? I believe in freedom of speech. I don't believe in you using that freedom of speech to commit fraud, to cause damage to people. You're responsible for that. That's criminal. And that's why you can say there's a limit on free speech based on if you're committing a direct fraud. If you're yelling fire in a crowded theater and you cause people to get injured, you got to be responsible for those injuries, right? If there's no fire, if there is a fire, well, then you're a freaking hero, right? And that would be, I think that's kind of like what we're doing now with COVID. Those of us who are challenging the mainstream narrative, but the reverse of that is being used as the excuse to censor us, to say that we're committing a fraud that might hurt people because we're challenging the narrative, like that misinformation could do this. And I almost like I kind of want to say that there's an easy alternative, and I support the disclaimering, just attaching disclaimers to stuff by social, which isn't censorship. You're a private company, you're hosting the conversation. If you think this is really harmful misinformation, then put a label on it and let people decide, like they have for some things. Like with Trump's tweets, they don't actually censor Trump, right? They just put a disclaimer. Basically, we at Twitter don't believe this is true. Okay. Right. But you're still respecting, you're not committing a fraud of telling someone that you can express yourself here within these limitations. And if people follow you, we will show them your content, because that's obviously not happening for a lot of us.
Well, and so on that note, there are some companies who wish to break the monopolistic hold on that specifically Silicon Valley companies tend to have, because all these companies are based in the Bay Area, right? So what is your view on BitChute, Parler, Gab, some of these other, attempted replacements. So far, I think, both Parler and Gab are meant to replace microblogging and Twitter, whereas BitChute is attempting to replace YouTube. I haven't really seen any sort of Facebook, Instagram, stuff like that, but those aren't as political.
Yeah, well, my understanding of those three you mentioned is that BitChute doesn't have any particular political inclination except being sort of libertarian in spirit and purpose. I don't know. I'm not an expert, but they're more than being just an alternative to YouTube, allowing video hosting online to be connected to the crypto ecosystem and for creators to be paid in Bitcoin or other cryptos. I think that is huge. Parler and Gab, I think, are kind of bullshit subversions of the mainstream conversation with this, supporting this idea that conservatives are the real target of censorship when obviously they are not. And but I have reservations about both. I never got into Gab, and Gab's been out for a few years. Parler a little newer. But bigger picture, your question, is there an alternative to Facebook? Yeah. There have been a number of attempts. One that I was a little bit involved with back in the day. When I say that, the internet is so old, I can say, yeah, when I was doing all the internet back in the day, which was a Wednesday, by the way. Thank you, Mr. Cook. Was that back then it was diaspora, and diaspora had a decentralized nature to it with communities, but required a certain overhead. And I am confident that eventually humanity will realize the potential of the internet without the effects, the polluting and retarding effects. Retardant? I don't know what's the politically correct term there. Definitely not retarded. But yeah, the of censorship and corporatism on the internet that have retarded our ability to realize its potential in bringing people together as an educational tool, as a self-awareness tool, as a global awareness of the whole human family tool, of knowing accurately what's going on in the rest of the world, of escaping tyranny, escaping oppression and limitations. And when you're as involved in it as I am, in one of the stories that I covered today, called it a war. There's a cyber war. The US and the UK have declared a cyber war on dissident voices and anybody who's challenging COVID. And now they have this whole new excuse to ramp things up. But whether it comes from reforming the existing social media, Facebook has and it's so many good conspiracy theories about how Facebook overtook MySpace. Remember, we were all Tom's friend at one point. And that even if you don't buy into any of those conspiracy theories, it doesn't matter. I mean, just watch the movie, The Network, was it Social Network? The first big sort of expose by Hollywood of Mark Zuckerberg, and even then, I don't think it went far enough. But I'm confident that, I'm confident in two things. One, that right now, sadly, we don't have the critical mass of people who understand the challenges of social media enough to even make a few efforts to click over to a new website to get away from ads. And the other thing is that I'm the positive thing I'm confident is that we will get there eventually. It's a natural progress of the development of the internet, of the great dance forward of humanity, of the progress of intellectual life itself, that we're going to figure these things out. We're going to adapt, improvise, and overcome, and all of that. But right now, you just got to be an active, engaged member of whatever audience you're in, and whatever content you're consuming, support it and support the creation of it, whether it's this podcast or mine or anybody else's that you value. We can't do it without you. This is not a business. I'm not a content creator for libertarian content to make money. It sounds silly when you say it like that, because no shit, right? No, we're doing this because we want to change things, and if we want to stand up to the injustices of the world. If we can support ourselves in the process and make it more than a hobby, I think most of us would be very happy with that. I'm certainly in that position. So right now, yeah, it sort of makes me want to take another bong rip thinking about all the great new excuses that COVID has given them for censorship. Excuse me. So does it more than answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. And so, and I have some similar reservations. My view on Parler has always been that I think non-conservatives should use it to depoliticize it as a way of sort of weakening Twitter. But I also think Twitter is kind of not the issue. In my personal view, the Alphabet Corporation, which controls Google and YouTube, is a much bigger threat to liberty than any social media. And so I'd like to see new YouTubes and DuckDuckGo. I'm very proud of.
I'll say if we kill corporatism and we increase that self-awareness or that conscious consumer awareness in the general public, in a sense, you're right. We don't have to take out Alphabet. We sort of have to reclaim its functions of the internet back to we, the people of the internet, and have decentralized blockchain-based systems. And then we're not subject to this. But you end corporatism, and intellectual property is the other core underpinning. Intellectual property is wrong as a concept. It is ethically wrong to use an idea as an excuse to violate someone's real property rights, to in any way use that as an excuse to use force to limit the free flow of information. And I don't think most people really appreciate this. It was hard for me, even as a libertarian, as sort of like the last big piece of my worldview to fall into place. I had to analyze and wrap my head around the whole racket of intellectual property. But when you understand that and properly reject it, because it's a deeply ingrained element of American propaganda that we all think, oh well, if I created an idea, I own it. If I invent something, if I wrote a book, it's like it's really connected to the American dream. But the American dream is much more along the lines of freedom than being able to claim ownership of a concept that allows you to use violence to control other people through government. Now you go, oh shit, that's what IP is? Yeah, doesn't sound very American, does it? And just one little caveat on this whole position. Oh, if you go to my website, thefreedomline.com, you get my book. There's a great section on IP. It's free. But it's fine to use intellectual property as a metaphor. Like CJ, if you and I were writing a book and we wanted a contract to describe the terms by which you and I were allowed to share the content, the material of the book itself, and we called that intellectual property metaphorically to explain the terms that you and I agree to voluntarily in that contract as co-creators, that's fine. But that's the only, except as a metaphor, as opposed to a concept of real property that excuses defense of it or enforcement of rights as if it was real property. No, anti-freedom, un-American government racket, and the sooner we get past intellectual property, the better. I am hopeful that the internet's killing it anyway. I remember the days of LimeWire and Napster, and yeah, back when the best you could do with the internet is share MP3s.
Well, and also, I did just mention the Alphabet Core, but YouTube actually contributes to that quite a bit with things like what do they call those, fanfiction stories, right? These guys with no endorsement, if you will, from these massive corporations, Disney and Viacom and all that. They just go and they make their own stories and lists and looks into lore and look at the theories and all that kind of stuff. And it's really, it's difficult to try and censor that, because not only is it, do people really enjoy it, but it's just like there's so much of it, right? How are you going to do it?
Yeah, no, I've never been into any kind of fan fiction in any meaningful way, but I'm with you. I've seen this phenomenon, and it's beautiful how it's getting people to question intellectual property. And it's like any of these. Twilight was the one I learned about this through first, right? Mr. Twilight, the vampire, his books. Yeah, he came out. No, but there was a huge following around that on the internet was doing a lot with fan fiction, and then was it Viacom? I don't know, whoever the hell, whichever corporate monster owns the rights to Twilight, started trying to crack down on some of that, and people were like, "Are you kidding me? Like, this is like, well, first of all, we're helping you, and like this is the things people don't realize all the positive benefits of the free flow of information and the ways that we've come to accept and expect the censorship through intellectual property that we experience today, and just getting over that it's all songs used to be folk songs. But just because you wrote the Twilight books, you think you own this new cultural touchstone? I hate to glorify something like 50 Shades of Grey, which also has a lot of fan fiction spin-offs, as if that's some kind of cultural landmark to be celebrated. Right. I don't remember. remember when humanity got to the point where 50 Shades of Grey was possible? Like, no, we're not going to be looking back at that great piece of literature. But similarly, how can you say just because you came up with this particular narrative that you own that? Well, you're going to stop me? Like, you own the name. I can't write about it in my journal, even from like, and then you go, well, why can't we do this online? Because we've given into this dangerous fiction behind the racket of intellectual property, which says that it's okay to use the force of government to impede the free flow of ideas. And you go, yeah, that's bad. That's not bad.
Yeah, I'm sure one of the biggest things too, and I'll get back to the some of the COVID questions after this, but one of the biggest things also that helped this, I think, also is the selling of Star Wars, because George Lucas was not very tyrannical, right? He let people do books and video games and all this stuff, and they can do whatever they want. Which to a certain extent, it's like he had the intellectual property, but it was in name only because he didn't use it, right? And then Disney came along and started like, no, I don't want these video games, and I'm shutting down this and forget that, you know what I mean? And all this stuff. And like a lot of people who are completely apolitical at that point got to see the actual effects of corporatism and corporate censorship.
It's like if someone bought the idea of Santa Claus.
Right.
I'm the first one to trademark it. I'm Santa Claus, or like you name yourself Santa Claus legally, and then go, you're using my name, you owe me money. Fuck you. This is for every no matter who came up with it first. Once it is shared and consumed by other people, that alone makes it part of our culture and our heritage, and therefore it in that sense really does belong to everybody.
So to get back to a question that was based off of the national mandates. So you did bring up something that I do think is very important for us to note, because just because it's just because it's not the federal government doing it doesn't necessarily mean it's not tyrannical, right? Far from it. A lot of states, and this is, people are focusing a lot on California and New York and big liberal states, but Pennsylvania has a Republican legislature, and that's also one of the big states. Idaho here has got some pretty interesting lockdowns. That's a very red state. So this is certainly impacting a lot of people. Some of these mandates do seem to be specifically geared towards a certain segment of the population. And in particular, it does appear in New York that the Jewish people are being targeted, in California that Christians are being targeted, and in a lot of places that certain businesses like the movie industry, movie theaters, right, and bars are being targeted. Number one, what do you think we as liberty-minded folk can actually do to help with that, other than, of course, shopping locally, which, by the way, shop locally, everybody. And also, what do you think why do you think that is? What's the beef with Christians, Jews, and people who have movie theaters?
Well, you forgot gym owners and salon owners, and
right.
So many others in the service and functions, restaurants, bars.
Yeah, restaurants.
But yeah, there's so many people disadvantaged in this. I don't think you can say that people are being targeted by those groups for those reasons. One of the things, when people were asking earlier on in this fear crisis, Adam, what do you think is really behind this? Is there a singular global conspiracy? And it's possible. I mean, there might be one behind it. There might be, might have been made in a Chinese lab and introduced there, and then there'll be some small. It's possible that some small element within the Chinese government, or even a step back in that chronology, it was an American lab, and it was the CIA that infiltrated the Chinese government and convinced them. Okay, whatever. Like, it could be that there is a sort of singular primary group of conspirators behind the whole thing. I think it's more that, I don't think there is. I don't think there's. It's more likely that you do at some point, you find a group of old white dudes in suits in a boardroom, right, deciding how the reaction to this is going to go. But regardless of what you take as like how centralized is the conspiracy, it's really like a feeding frenzy of conspiracies that is driving this, or not there. Lots of groups conspiring at different levels to take advantage of this moment in history. Was it grown in a lab or not? I don't know. That doesn't even answer the question here, because it could have been that and stolen and gotten out by one person who had one interest, or it could have been manipulated by just a whole random chain of events where you see there's the pharmaceutical conspiracy around this, right? There are people who want to manipulate things. You look at all the major players in the world today who get to use this, right, to further their interests. Of course, the big ones at the center of the racket, still banks that can print out fiat currency. And in the U.S., I don't even know. I checked a while. It was over $9 trillion of liquidity added to the market because of COVID, I misspoke. Not because of COVID, with COVID as the excuse.
Yeah, exactly.
I almost repeated some propaganda there without context. But yeah, I don't do that. I don't do that when I can avoid it. So there's the media conspiracy, there's the Republican conspiracy, the Democrat conspiracy, the banking conspiracy, the pharmaceutical conspiracy, the real estate players conspiracy. There are all sorts of people who, as groups, are working together within their groups to conspire to make people afraid, to further their own financial personal interests. And so to get to the direct part of your question, are they targeting Jews? I don't think so. I think it's part of actually, in this case, especially in New York, the Jews who are facing persecution for meeting in temples are more propaganda pawns in the sort of general government conspiracy of everybody who has an interest in the strengthening of the police state and arbitrary government power. And I would say the same thing with Christians. I don't think Christians are being targeted as Christians. They are being targeted as people who are challenging the narrative that serves all these other economic interests. When you go to church in civil disobedience, as my friend Stephen McClure, as a pastor in Georgia, has, it's not just California. This is really all over the country. You are seeing a suppression of religious gatherings, and I don't think you can even separate Jews and Christians, from the way that it's being applied, except for being perhaps more visible or vocal about it. And then, so I think there are people who are being targeted like that, along with the general public, just in order to support the general narrative. But then you look at the policies, and who, qui bono, right? Who's benefiting from this? Who's profiting? Netflix, Amazon, Elon Musk, all of these people, all these billionaires whose net worth has gone up more than you can really even capture in terms of how much money is that? What is the value of that? Like, it's so much money that this is an accounting trick. This isn't reflective of reality or value. You couldn't even do it, but they are able to get a strange power over us with that money and the manipulation of the economy, because it's enforced. And that's, there's all the conspiracy around strengthening the military and the police state in order to serve the general purpose of government, again, keeping the super rich getting richer at the expense of the rest of us.
Do you think there's anything to be said about, a lot of people have noted that in China, they don't seem to target a specific religion, but they do target a set of religious ideals, which seems to be found in Christianity, Islam. Falun Gong is another big one, but basically like extreme devotion and fundamentalism. Do you think there's anything to be said about certain people not liking, not necessarily exclusively religious groups, but religious groups as an example? Because,
yes.
For example, I as a Christian would say that, there's the famous saying, whoever, regardless of who's president, Christ is king. That might be a little insulting to a statist. Do you think that might have anything to do with what is perceived to be specifically geared towards Christians and Jews and stuff like that?
Yes and no. And I have to point out two conflicting dynamics that are shifting, I think, in the relationship between government and religion over the course of human history. And one is that traditionally, religions have been used by governments as a mechanism of control. God told me to be king. God willed it to be king. The Bible says
divine right.
The Bible says render unto Caesar. And really, I think that is hugely misinterpreted. A particular quote from the Bible really should have. I mean, knowing even what I know, what I consider to be the fictional character of Christ, render unto Caesar wouldn't mean submit or give him. Like when he's talking about money, we're talking about the Roman coin with his face,
Yeah.
with his face on it. Let him have that fucking money. Don't use it. It would be like I think the modern equivalent would be like, let government keep their fucking greenbacks and use crypto and silver and gold and barter instead. Fuck that. Render under government what is government's. Render under the people what is the people's. And he said render under Caesar and render under God. So in that sense, religion has historically served government as a mechanism of control. But as that started to shift in the modern era, for two ways: one, the general weakening of religious institutions, but the general weakening of religiosity in terms of doctrinary religion among the public. And debate this till the cows come home, but there's an undeniable trend towards atheism and agnosticism. And I'm more of a pantheist myself. So I don't think we want to go down all those rabbit holes that we just skimmed over in this conversation. But the important thing here in the transition that I think you and I would both recognize why we have come to this point where Christianity and religion are at odds with government is that connection has been particularly weakened, and the American concept of separation of church and state has helped quite a lot. But as a result, then, governments can no longer use religion the same way. The government has no problem with, by the way, I will make a distinction here among Christians. There are those of you like CJ for whom religion, I would presume, is a positive influence in your life and a way of living better and being more aware and a way to connect you to God and in your concept of spirituality. And you don't take the Bible as a literal historical document because you're not, in denial of historical fact. And you would never take it as an excuse to do anything other than in the spirit of the beautiful teachings of Christ of loving thy neighbor. And that's in contrast to the people who go to mega churches in order to ignore the fact that they're supporting an evil system with their lifestyles in the American government, and they're going to support the troops and rah and vote for who the pastor says so. And those guys, government has no problem with. But the general competition now is at such a deeper level that governments all around the world want to be the religion. And they are succeeding in that. And if you think about, even in America, you think about, except for really the most devout of Christians. What's the average Christian involvement in America? The average American who identifies as a Christian goes to church once a week and gives them some money, maybe volunteers with the church a few times a year, something like that is the average.
Well, I would say definitely. In fact, there's the population of the country which is considered evangelical, which is really what we have replaced the term fundamentalist with, is about 13%, which is, that's small. It's 22% for non-religious, right? So that's a very small number.
Here's the bigger point. I don't think we have to dissect the comparisons here to make this overwhelming point obvious, which is that you take the average person who identifies as Christian, or even a sort of hardcore fundamentalist evangelist in the United States. Let's take that as a standard, because I would say 90% of Christians are less involved in that. Self-identified Christians don't go to church consistently, don't donate consistently, don't volunteer consistently, don't proselytize consistently. But even among those who do, how much money do they give to the church? The other half of their income, because one half is going to government. Yeah, the average working American taxpayer is working for government half the year when you add up everything that's taken out of your check with all the other hidden fees, fines, and costs of government, taxes built into your retail price before the sales tax is added on. You really do the full accounting. The average working American is working for government half the year. Do they give the other half to the church and live in a box? No. They give 10% of the remainder. 5%? Someone who tithes conscientiously at 10%, they're not doing it for their gross, they're doing it for their take-home, right? Your take-home income, after you just don't even count the part that you had to give to government. That's how deep of a religion it is. How much time do they spend reading the Bible versus watching political news, versus listening to duopoly politicians give speeches, versus vote? How many of them vote in their church elections for community leadership versus vote regularly in political elections. No. You want to know what the national religion of the modern age is? It's not Christianity. None of these religions come anywhere close to competing with the religion of statism.
Well, and I think one of the things that's interesting about that, I'll note briefly, and there's obviously a lot of points there, but I think it's interesting. You look at a guy like William Jennings Bryan, right, who is considered to be like one of the spearheads of fundamentalism from back in the day, but something like 100 years ago at this point, a little bit over actually. And of course, as liberty-minded folk, there's a lot of things that we would take issue with William Jennings Bryan on, like his idea of purposefully inflating the economy. It was completely ridiculous. The guy had no idea, any economic theory whatsoever. But it's interesting. You see, and you see this is carried over to evangelical Christians, Orthodox Jews, a lot of the devoutly religious. It does appear that there's been, and I would argue, because we have, John Locke is the guy who kind of formulated the Western thought of separation of church and state as we understand it today, at least, because it's, other philosophers, of course, have gone into it. But, even Martin Luther with the Reformation, what I think, that was such a huge deal for Western society, freeing, Germany and France and Britain, and even a lot of places, where it's like in England, you're not literally owned by the Holy Roman Empire, but you might as well have been, and it's interesting because now you do have these Orthodox Jews, Karaite Jews, Messianic Jews, or evangelical Christians, and the fundamentalists and stuff like that. And they are kind of, they're almost, it's not even just in opposition. It's almost like a hostility to government and vice versa. Right. And it's an interesting dynamic shifts. Absolutely.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you made that distinction with the birth of Protestantism and the idea that it was a major positive political reformation of separating church and authoritarianism and making it harder to use as a tool of authority. And it's important to point out that there are some people with religious messages who say we can get to God, we can get to spiritual peace and enlightenment without violating basic ethics, without using authority. And there are those who want you to say, I am the way to God, follow me. And people's bullshit detectors have gotten a lot better over the years. But before we move on to anything else you do, what was my sort of overall characterization of your Christianity at least put you in the right half of that split?
Well, so yes and no. The no part would be I am pretty firmly fundamentalist. In my personal opinion, I take a view, though, that's very similar to the old fundamentalists, like Billy Sunday and those guys, where it was like, you can't really be a fundamentalist without love. You can't really be a fundamentalist without, right? I mean, for crying out loud, the whole story of the pericope adultery, right, with the woman caught in adultery.
You're not a fearing Christian, you're a God-loving Christian.
Exactly. Right? That's the whole purpose. People often take that verse. I just want to briefly say, they say that, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, right? The beginning, like a child, right? Like children who are tiny, they know.
Past it. You don't stay in that fear.
Exactly.
It's a way to move on to a better centered, loving state.
100%. And what's interesting about that is you as a pantheist realizing that are doing better than a lot of Christians I know, which is it's an interesting thing.
No, it's sad because I went through a bit of a personal process myself of being raised vaguely Christian and vaguely Jewish at the same time, which means not strictly either, of course.
Right.
And being encouraged to discover my own spirituality and going through a punk phase and going through the intellectual exploration of atheism and agnosticism and science versus mythology and religion and all of that. And at one point was kind of one of those hardcore assholes. I mean, atheists, which is for a lot of them, you proselytize motherfuckers more than Christians. You turn atheism into a religion. You kind of fucked it up. And to that, like, I still believe in the rational conclusions, but to me, pantheism is not just an acknowledgement of the spiritual nature of the universe, that which is beyond the understanding of science, the pervasive vibration of love that unites all matter, that underlying fabric of energy that it defines the universe, that you could describe as the God force or the love force. But from that, I've actually come to a better appreciation of most Christians, actually, or I should say most of the Christians that I know who still know me because they're good people, right? They're the appreciation that I've gained is an understanding that, it's like this is something that you can bring into your life that makes you a better person, that improves your experience of life. And if that's the case, and it doesn't, I can disagree and say, well, I don't like your mythology, but if we both respect that, in a sense, that's what religion is, and that's what spirituality is, and that we really got to love each other and respect each other's rights, and that those are the only legitimate conclusions that you can practically come to in politics from any genuine spirituality, I'm all for that. Let's do that.
Well, and it's interesting, right? There is, and I want to get into a few cases real quick while we have a little bit of time left, so I'll kind of leave it at this. But it is interesting, philosophically, you would probably be more in the natural rights camp, right? Whereas I would probably be more in the I can't say probably, right? I know myself. In the God-given rights camp, right? But we agree in that they're rights, and we should, there should be a big tent on that to an extent, right? Where it's like, all right, so you might think they come from nature, I might think they come from God, but they're rights; they can't be taken away.
I would think that when it comes to a sort of rational, scientific application of these concepts, if you're a Christian talking to an atheist, you still have to be able to make the case for a standard of rights based in observable reality. And you might say that my nature comes from God, but what is my nature? Let's look at that. And when you look at that, you've got to a much more humane, universally accepted model, which is that you own yourself. You can say it, you can choose to acknowledge that God owns you, sure, but on earth, God made you the custodian because he gave you free will. And you are the custodian of yourself, of your consciousness, of your body. You have that independence. When we talk about self-ownership as libertarians, it's not, well, you own yourself and that's the religion I believe in. No, we say you own yourself because that's observable reality, no matter what your spiritual premise to your existence is. You own yourself as a free, beautiful, independent human being. And that is a foundation for rights, comes from ethics. And this is again, basic Christian ethics of the non-aggression principle. If God gave you free will, well, God gave me free will, and I'm pretty sure he doesn't want you to fuck with it. So leave me alone with that shit. Don't use your government, don't use your religion as an excuse to do something ungodly by your definition to me.
And it is interesting, right, that it is by your own definition, right? I mean, it was the Pharisees who used the state to nail Jesus to a cross, right? But I digress on that because I do want to briefly get into some of these cases. There are so many big court cases, criminal court cases. Not everybody probably thinks, oh, you mean like elections, right? No, I mean prosecuting Americans for doing things that are not prosecutable. And I want to see if we can get a little bit of commentary on that before we head out. So there's three that come to or four, excuse me, that come to the tip of my head at first. And then there's a couple more that perhaps you might bring up because I know there's tons right now. I mean, there literally is tons. But Julian Assange is, they're still talking about extraditing him to the States. Some people have called for his execution, unbelievably. I mean, that is insane to me. Tony Spell, now the pastor in Louisiana, has been arrested some 70 times for refusing to shut down his church. Cliven Bundy is being charged again for the Bundy Ranch incident. And, that might actually be the only three I could think of off the top of my head, I guess. But no, Chelsea Manning, of course. How could I forget Chelsea Manning? The Chelsea Manning situation, right? She is currently having
the persecution of Assange, right?
Right, exactly. Which is ridiculous because Manning was pardoned, right? They're literally, it's just an excuse to go after somebody who was already, but at any rate. So, and there's other cases that are obviously big as well. Some of them have already been dealt with. Roger Stone happens to be lucky enough to know the president, so that got dealt with pretty quickly. But a lot of people, that's not the case. And unfortunately, we're seeing some of the ramifications there. And you know, a lot of us are kind of wondering, like, what is it that even can be done at this point? I mean, Cliven Bundy beat the courts, and Tony Spell is just using his First Amendment rights to assembly and religion. And yet these guys are being, and Julian Assange, of course, freedom of the press. So what's some of the things we as liberty-minded folk can start to, if not help with that, but just try to change this culture that is prosecuting so many people across the country for just basic human rights?
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'm going to try to answer this from a bigger perspective that helps guide my activism, because when I was getting, involved full time with Iraq Veterans Against the War, I think it was years ago, and because of that, followed the story of Jeremy Hastings, the Rolling Stone reporter, who was covering a particular racket at the Pentagon and exposing some generals, and then died mysteriously in a car accident. Where you go, yeah, right, no way, that was a murder. And so I take it very carefully for myself. When I talk about challenging government power at the most fundamental level, and running for president, as I'm getting ready, in the long term to do, as long as support keeps building for 2024, with the Libertarian Party again, of course. I'm not poking any individual bears, I hope. I think I can take the ground out from underneath them by changing the paradigm in a positive way without exposing any individuals to criminal liability in such a way that would make them want to kill me. And it's not helpful either. Like, why go for one fish when you can drain the swamp, right? What? Or why get in a wrestling match with one swamp monster when you can at least poke little holes in the bottom or pull the plug and slowly start draining it? And I think that's a lot more effective of an approach. But then on the absolute flip side of that, and I want to caution people to never get too consumed with individual cases when they can't do anything. But if you have a friend or a neighbor or a journalist who you respect or an activist who's facing persecution in a situation that you can alleviate the suffering caused by government, I say absolutely do it. Some of the most important work that we can do, and you might think, well, you're playing whack-a-mole with the state. That's one way of looking at it. But you're not just whacking moles back into a box hopelessly. You are actually applying your perspective, your knowledge, your skills to immediately alleviate human suffering. And so I would apply that to certain issues as well. If you can get a law changed, although in that case, you might be running up against the profiteers. A lot of people who get set up, like in Washington State, legal cannabis shops under the alcohol board, ABC, Alcohol Board of Control, or whatever it is. There's some silly state agency that controls all those sales. And turns out, shockingly, oh yeah, the bureaucrats are exploiting the shop owners.
Mm-hmm.
You get involved in some of that, you might be in that, you're finding yourself wrestling with swamp monsters instead of draining the swamp or pulling victims out of the swamp. And I think, going to those two things might help guide people in their efforts to make the world a better place. You mentioned those stories, man. Those are some of the horror stories of today, but and a sign of how far back we have stepped. But again, it doesn't shake my confidence in the big picture, long-term, positive outlook for humanity.
And also, I do want to name or drop some positive news for some people. Speaking of the Bundys, Todd Engel has actually been released from prison finally. So he was the last straggler from the Bundy Ranch to still be in. Yeah, and they finally got him. So that was a pretty awesome thing. That a lot of these things I think will turn out for good. A lot of them not. Honestly, I'm a little bit cynical about Assange because there's just such a vendetta against him that I don't know that. But at the same time, I almost think that will make him a very strong martyr against the state, if indeed it comes to that. Because everybody sees what's going on with Assange.
Yeah,
I mean, Trump used Assange to win the election and then just threw him off to the side. You know what I mean? Like,
Assange, Snowden, and Manning are sort of unique cases at this upper level of threat and influence to the statist racket. That there are other, reasons to go after them, and there are other benefits of defending them without exposing yourself. And I think, I've done a significant amount of work lately. I don't say work, but like just co-production stuff and doing shows together with a lot of the Action for Assange people. And I earlier praised Lynn Ulbricht, who really has dedicated her life to freeing her son from 2 unfairly imposed double life sentence, and they are doing incredible work. And I think when you're raising awareness about someone like that, at one point I was almost someone like that, when I was in jail for gun rights, but we got out when tricky circumstances there. But for people for whom they have made themselves successfully, as I would hope to be for the message of libertarianism in general. But Julian Assange, with everything that he's done with WikiLeaks, with Snowden for everything that he's done with the NSA, for Ross Ulbricht for everything that he's done for in undermining the drug war. These are people you can support, knowing that just by telling their names and stories to people, you are helping raise awareness in a whole other way. So on that note, here's to them, and here's to the real winner of the 2020 election, those of us on drugs winning the war on drugs.
Well, and yeah, let's, by the way, just remember that too. There was a huge smack in the face for the drug war across so many states in 2020. That was a positive.
Yeah, and there's I've been talking about that a lot lately. We had a couple of guests on Adam versus the Man talking about that today. It is huge. We have experienced a significant amount of predictable incremental change for 2020. But looking at it now, you go, this has gotten us to a critical mass of a tipping point that is going to lead to I think, a pretty significant acceleration, even of our incremental change over the next few election cycles, with full decrim of all personal use in the state of Oregon. And, even here in my home state in Arizona, thank you, Prop 207 voters, who got us barely from legal to recreational. But I think this election represents the end of the beginning of the end of the war on drugs, and the beginning of the middle of the end of the war on drugs. And there's so many pervasive positives. I could rant for hours about the medical benefits of cannabis, but MDMA, PTSD therapy with that, psilocybin now, for the veterans community especially, and since we didn't bring it up at all in this show, I'm a 2004 Fallujah USMC combat vet, and it's been a big part of my motivation, seeing the war, the greatest injustice that the state is capable of up close and personal.
And with that, I think that's a good place for us to end off here. Went a little bit over the hour, but I appreciate Mr. Kokesh being here with us today. This is the first time that we have gotten on talking about our agreements, and there's a lot of them. So I think we need, it's good for us to hash those out. In fact, I even plan at some point of organizing an in-person conference, hopefully sponsored by the Libertarian and Constitution parties, amongst others, where we hammer some of these issues out in formalized debates, because that's just the thing that educated and civilized people do. But
this is surprised in this, CJ. I mean, I didn't think we'd be discussing the intersections of COVID, authoritarianism, and religion. That was a fun turn.
Well, it's interesting because people, a lot of people tend to not realize just how impacted they are by statism. And I like to point out to people, Shane Dawson. Shane Dawson is obviously not political, but he's a YouTube creator and he's being impacted by censorship. Tony Spell, not a libertarian, but he's a pastor and he's being impacted by government censorship. Julian Assange, the journalist, right? And you go on down the line, and it's like, people need to realize this is an impact to, so many different things. Something happened with my camera there. I wonder what's up with that. But anyways, we're done anyways. So thank you guys very much. I do appreciate y'all showing up here. If you like this kind of content, please do subscribe. This is the Cynicogue. We got 2 different podcasts. This is the Watchdog. I also do some religious apologetics work if you're interested in that sort of stuff. social media, any sort of Patreon, that kind of stuff in the description below. We're also going to have links to Adam's YouTube as well as links to his book Freedom.
Don't go to
thank
YouTube.
You guys very much. I have one last.
I'm not on my main YouTube channel. We're temporarily banned there. It's a long, stupid story, but yeah, questioning the World Health Organization or local officials' health recommendations on COVID will get you banned on YouTube right now.
Well, so and you heard it here first, right?
The Freedom Line, thefreedomline.com, thefreedomline.com, or AdamVersusTheMan.com for my production. They cross-reference, and yeah, you got to ask yourself, especially right now, what message is being kept from you.
And I have one question to ask for all of y'all as a sort of end to this. In the face of Armageddon, will you compromise? Shalom.